Hello and welcome back to Catapult Your Career, where we delve into the reality of various careers and explore practical advice for numerous professions. And on this episode, we're going to look a little bit into the charity sector. And this is kind of one that's very kind of close to me in particular. So I'm really looking forward to kind of cracking on and getting stuck in with this. But I have none other than a good friend in Chris joining us today. So how are you, Chris?
Good evening. Yeah, I'm very well. Thank you, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm all good. I'm better to have seen your lovely face, that cultivated beard of yours. Very good.
Yeah, this is the haggard look. This is the no haircut look.
I think you pull it off well. For those who are blessed to see your video rather than just audio, there's a difference in styles, but you know I won't hold it against you. But anyhow, it's good to have you, Chris. Honestly, on a serious note, and we kind of delve into obviously the charity sector, and I believe your role into an organisation we will delve even more into in terms of Care4Calais is a distribution coordinator. But just to start the ball rolling, I suppose, give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and your kind of background.
Yep. Well, as you can probably pick up by my accent, I'm from Ireland, so you might need to put subtitles on this later. But yeah, no. So I'm 28 years old. I moved over to England when I went over to university. It was the kind of first big leap that I'd had away from. I grew up in quite a small town, so it was quite a big leap to leave home and jump into somewhere kind of completely new. And I really loved it. I stayed over in England for about 8 or 9 years, working in various things, a couple of kind of jobs after university. I studied history, not most of them related to history, mind, but and then I got into hockey. I've played hockey since I was much younger, and I started coaching hockey over there in England, and then started working within hockey as well. That kind of went up until about the pandemic, when obviously everything stopped. There was no hockey, there was no sport. And then at that point, I left that area and came over to Calais, originally as a volunteer. I volunteered with Care4Calais here for a year. It was supposed to be 6 months and ended up being a year. Sorry, 6 weeks. Ended up being a year. And then I've kind of I've gone away, but I've never really left it. So I went back home a couple of times back over to Ireland, and then came back out here. And I've been here in this role since April.
Amazing. And I think, thank you for kind of giving us a bit of a kind of a history of how you've ended up to where you are today. And of course, we're definitely kind of go on to Care4Calais. And I think the reason why I kind of, this is kind of close to me, I suppose, is myself and my wife have gone over a couple of times over a 2-year period as well to volunteer with Care4Calais. And I think it's a tremendous charity that does really kind of just work that we're kind of explore even more. But before we get into that, I mentioned and introduce yourself as a distribution coordinator. So in terms of that title, sounds very fancy. What is a distribution coordinator?
Yeah, I mean, really what we do is we manage a team of volunteers. So it can vary. The numbers of volunteers that we have varies. It goes up in the summer and around Christmas, and it goes down the rest of the time, largely based on term times. But we manage a group of volunteers in the morning in a warehouse, and then in the afternoon we are out on a distribution site where we meet refugees from various different backgrounds, nationalities, ethnicities, and we run what we refer to as our distributions. That might be giving out clothes, or it might be hot drinks, tea, coffee, as I say, games, phone charging, various things like that. So it's, I suppose, technically in terms of hours, it's kind of 9 to 6. But it's very much not a regular 9 to 5 sort of job to it.
Yeah. And I was going to say, there's, like you said, you could almost replace 9 to 6 with 24/7 because things are changing so rapidly, whether it's during the day or through the night, I could imagine. So yeah, definitely like a full on kind of role. And you mentioned Care4Calais. Obviously, your role is more organising kind of a group of volunteers to do those activities. Tell us a bit more about Care4Calais. What is Care4Calais?
So yeah, Care4Calais was set up in 2016 in response to the situation that was happening here on the ground in Calais. At that time, as probably most people have heard of, there was what's referred to as the Calais jungle. So that was a kind of fairly static refugee camp settlement area that had roughly between 10 and 12,000 people living in it, who were all trying to make the crossing to the UK to claim asylum. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a kind of vacuum of kind of international organizations, so like, the UN and various things like that. So it kind of became a situation where individuals or groups had to set up organizations or charities to help this situation. So Care4Calais was kind of set up on the back of that. It's as I say, volunteer led, and I think although initially when it was set up, it was predominantly focused on the Calais side of things here and the actual direct provision of aid, it has subsequently grown to be a very big organization within the UK as well. In particular, it kind of looks at like lobbying and looking to change policies, bringing court cases, etc., on behalf of asylum seekers. And also it does a similar sort of thing with direct provision of aid as well there, regionally as well, where people are being maybe put in hotels or other sort of dispersal accommodation.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that you've drawn on this, and for the listeners that kind of usually tune in, that we will definitely kind of hone in onto the charity sector and your role. But I think it's important. This is something not only just passionate to you clearly, but to myself as well. And I think it's something that perhaps we don't see the full story of when we're in the UK on the other side of the kind of sea. And you mentioned first and foremost with the charities, I think it's a really good point that in an ideal world you wouldn't have charities because they often fill a gap perhaps of kind of something which is inhumane or that you would in a perfect world not happen. And I suppose that then going also to that lobbying part as well, in an ideal world you wouldn't have the charity because you wouldn't have that problem existing in the world. But that charity can only do so much on an operational level, and whether it's giving out food or provision at a basic level. But if you were to only do that, unfortunately, you would be there for 5, 10, 15, 20 odd years. So, I don't know what your reflection is when I kind of share that back to you, but I think that lobbying piece as well is also one of the things why I personally can get on board, because I think it's also quite an important factor.
Absolutely, Michael. Yeah, it's. I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's two sides of the same sword, really. Unfortunately, and at times you are kind of banging your head against the wall here. We are very lucky here to have a great team, and we often, like yourself, we have really good volunteers who come out who are really engaged, really willing to do what we're here to do. But the situation has been ongoing here in Calais since 1998. Yeah. And unfortunately, we don't really know how long it will go on for. It's one of these rare kind of rules, I guess, in terms of this sector where you kind of want to put yourself out of a job, really, if you're doing it well, or if things work out, rather. But yeah, the other side of it, the advocacy side, and maybe the more legal side, and the UK kind of side of things is huge. And I think as well, we sometimes can be in a little bit of a kind of bubble here, maybe, even though we're so close to Britain. It can be that you're in a bit of a bubble because you're dealing with the immediate stuff that's happening here, which can be very engrossing. So yeah, it takes that side of it in the UK, other people in the UK, other organisations as well, to really be trying to actually change the situation and mean that we're not here.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's not a completely like strange like policy, I suppose, in terms of like managing yourself out of a job, because I mean, even if you apply it to kind of career skills in terms of being a manager, and I think back on my past experiences, the best managers managing themselves out of that role. So you're not there micromanaging like your team all the time. You're empowering like your colleagues to like do their job. And every now and again they say, just want to check, is this all right? And you're like, yeah, great. And that's it. You end up doing nothing. And it's exactly the same as this kind of situation. And I suppose as well, then if we look more to that role and how that kind of distribution coordinator, has this been your kind of first experience of kind of of charities? For those that are listening, charities, unfortunately, like I said, that in terms of having a need for the charity in the first place, are very wide ranging. There's so many humanitarian aids and issues that charities face. But yeah, tell us a bit more about your experience, I suppose, with charities.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first experience that I've had in this humanitarian sector, I suppose you would say, the humanitarian aid sector, the kind of crisis of displaced peoples. I've had some experience in the past, mostly to do with other roles. So I'd worked with the National Trust and I'd worked with the Woodland Trust in various different capacities, and that was in maybe a bit more of a heritage and kind of environmental side of things. And then also through different things to do with sports, I've also been engaging with kind of young like kids and trying to get maybe disadvantaged kids and women in particular, target groups as they would say, into sports or into social environments and various things like that. But certainly within this sector, yeah, this is the first experience I have, and I think one of the kind of clear defining things for that is, particularly for me, for where I'm from, Ireland, and that it's not really something that we see. There are asylum seekers living in Ireland, in Belfast, in my hometowns, and various things like that, but it's not a very visible crisis. It's something that sometimes now doesn't even make it onto the news. It's the kind of last piece, maybe, because obviously there's a lot more going on at the minute anyway. But I think we can therefore kind of maybe think that this was a big thing in 2016 and then kind of naively go, oh, and it must be sorted now. But obviously we do see, we see that it's an ongoing crisis. It's been a crisis for decades, like I say, centuries in a wider sense. And yeah, I suppose in terms of actually getting into it, it wasn't something I was particularly aware of. As I say, I knew that there were people in Calais, mainly because I'd actually just driven through Calais once on my way back from a trip and kind of saw, whoa, this is really strange. And then Care4Calais, the nature of it means that you can just come over. You could, at that time, you had to come for a minimum of 2 weeks because of the coronavirus pandemic, but you can just come over and both learn about it and experience it, but also offer your help, offer your support. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And I know maybe you'll come onto this, and I don't want to be jumping the gun, but I think that's one of the big advantages of this sector is it's very easy to get practical experience in this, because without it having to be that you're maybe doing an apprenticeship or you're maybe having to ask people to shadow them for months or weeks until you get an idea of something. You can come here for a day and you can get some sort of experience of it. And it's not just Care4Calais, there's many other organizations across the north of France and elsewhere. So I suppose that really was one of the things that actually for me was how I got into it in the first place, is just sending an email and, oh, there we go, I'm all of a sudden I'm going to Calais.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like, in terms of that barriers to entry, to kind of experience in different environments, whether it's professional or personal, like you said, that's a massive plus. And just to kind of start to round off the conversation around Care4Calais before we then change direction to the charity sector and the role for the listeners who are wanting to perhaps enter that industry. There's two things in terms of just myths and misconceptions. Perhaps it would be interesting to get your viewpoint around kind of refugees, because even for me, I had a warped perception before I kind of went to Calais. And you always hear the kind of get it from the horse's mouth. You definitely do that when you kind of arrive on the beaches of Calais. And the two things for me, I suppose, is and I'm going to ask this in an ignorant way on purpose, Chris, so you have to apologise. Why are they only crossing over the sea, though? Why can't they just kind of, you saw the Ukrainians, they had a war, they kind of popped over. Why are they just crossing over the sea for?
Yeah, it's funny you say about it being an ignorant question, because when I first got here, I would have asked the same thing, and I think that's one of the things is nobody. I mean, I've been doing this for about 2 years. It does not in any way make me an expert on this either, But with regards to your question, it's because there's not really any other option. You've mentioned there the Ukrainian scheme where people were given visas. The Eurostar were doing free passes for people from Ukraine. People from most of the countries, cultures that we support don't have that option. And maybe even in terms of paperwork, they don't have documentation, they don't have passports, so they can't just jump on a plane, they can't just jump on a train. And I mean, at the end of the day, if they could, they would, but they can't. There are currently at this moment 3 schemes for direct entry programs, as they say, to the UK. One is for people from Hong Kong, one is for people from Afghanistan, and one is for people from Ukraine, as you've mentioned. But the majority of the people that we meet are not from any of these places. There are a large number from Afghanistan, but that's because the scheme in that sense is quite limited. But these are people from Sudan, Eritrea, South Sudan, places, the Kurdish places that don't have the same opportunity to, travel. Eritrea, it's illegal to leave the country, so it means that it's very limited for people. It's very difficult for people to make what we might perceive to be a very simple journey.
Yeah, and the Eritrea one again, talking about like mind blown. Like I remember having, I was very fortunate actually that one of the volunteers was from an Eritrean community as well, and there was talk about almost taxes that even once you leave a country, you're still paying money to that country, and if you don't, on return, you could lose your assets, e.g., your house, which is, for me as a UK citizen, born privileged. You have no idea about these things. You just wake up, you get a nice little national health service. If you don't get a job, there's kind of stuff to support you in terms of a safety net, and you crack on. And I think these little things, information and knowledge is so flipping powerful because it kind of destroys those barriers in terms of those perceptions. And I think that the final kind of question I want to ask around Care4Calais before we kind of move on is, I can't remember. I think it was one of the Sun newspaper, or it was a newspaper which had a very bold and devastating picture of a child that had passed away from the Calais crossing. And we, in general, not just refugees, anything, I would say as a society, have a much different reaction to children when they pass and what happens to them. But the general conception, and again I'll ask it the same kind of time, is why is it just single older males that come over? What about where's the women? Where's the children? Why is it just single older males?
Yeah, I suppose one of the first things to say about that is they're not necessarily single. Quite often these people are married. I'm not going to kind of do it down the line of, a different culture does this, but people marry quite young in various places. And I think one of the other, and again, this kind of goes back to what you've said before there as well, of our perception of travel is warped by the idea of how globalization works, that we can get on a Ryanair flight, or other airlines are available, and go somewhere within a couple of hours, whether it's locally, nationally, internationally, whatever that is, But for the people who we meet here, these are very long journeys. And to give you an example, which I guess kind of maybe in some ways counters that narrative, is there was an individual who I'd met here 2 years ago, who was called Mohammed. He was from Côte d'Ivoire, and he was 21 years old. So he exactly fits that narrative, that what you're talking about there, of a young man. So when he arrives in the UK, people will go, "Oh, look, it's another young man." The problem is he left Côte d'Ivoire when he was 12. So there is that young child. There's that young adult, or there's that infant, because that's not even a young adult at that age. That's a child. There's that child. And if we had it where we have safe and legal routes, that 12-year-old arriving in the UK looks very, very different, exactly like you say, to the public perception than a 21-year-old does. But if we think about our formative years, you and I, and probably your listeners too, we can think back to when we were 14 or whatever. I remember getting my first phone, and it was still £5 top up, and you had to send text talk because you couldn't send more than whatever amount of words. And school discos, and getting your GCSEs and your A levels, and learning to drive your car. That entire time, people like Mohammed were crossing through deserts, were crossing the Mediterranean Sea, were maybe detained in prison in Libya. And that, that's that person's formative years. That's his years without seeing his family, without seeing his friends, being alone. And then he maybe arrives to the UK when he's 21 years old. But that's a very different image, like I say, bearing in mind for some people like that too, because again, some of the narratives people talk about is, why do they not stop in the first country they come to? He left Côte d'Ivoire and he went to Niger, the next country that borders it, which is the poorest country in the world. So it's not the case. It's not as easy as moving to the next safe place. Sudan now has one of the highest proportions of people moving to it from various other countries, South Sudan and Ethiopia and Eritrea. So we have Sudanese refugees here. It's not about moving. It's not about just leaving your place and going to the first place you come to. And again, I think that all kind of ties into that idea. Similarly, maybe one of the other things too about it is that the people who arrive in the UK might be the last people who've crossed the Mediterranean. I think there's maybe a bit of a misconception too that it's everyone who crosses the Mediterranean wants to come to the UK. They don't. There's people here in France. There's people in Germany. There's people in Italy. There's people in Sweden. Everywhere else. These are people who maybe have family ties to the UK, speak the language of the UK because maybe they've been under the British Empire in the past, various things. So there's, like you say, there's a lot of maybe generalized misconceptions to this, but I realize that we're talking about the charity sector maybe as a whole, and I'm maybe just getting a little bit too engaged in this side of it. But but it is the thing, I guess, of maybe here there is in this sector there's a lot of scope to be potentially quite frustrated by things, but also very passionate and very engaged and very wanting to learn about things.
Definitely, and I think first and foremost, and this might lose me listeners, it might lose me kind of business and all the rest of it, but it's more important for me. I always talk about my values, and one of my values is integrity, and I'd rather live the life I want to live, and my authentic self, and actually push away people who don't want to interact with me, and actually attract the people who do want to interact with me. And that's equally as important for me. And that's why, I wanted to give a time and a space. And going back to our very early conversation around there's operational measures you can do in terms of giving out food and basic kind of support. But perhaps what would actually create change in the future is that lobbying and also the sharing of information and then sharing of knowledge that empowers others to have that window break and go, Christ, actually, it's not quite just how I perceived or how the media is telling it to me. And I think what you said is kind of extremely powerful. And just to kind of round off that conversation about the first country, which was going to be my next question, so well done, is if something horrible happened to the UK and I had to leave the UK, I've got Ireland, definitely not. Sorry, mate. There's people like you. I did.
Why do you think I'm in France?
Exactly. You're enough. I can't do anymore. But in all jest, you have Ireland, you've got Wales, you've got Scotland. Now I tell you, Scotland I might be turn my head to Scotland because that is my happy place. But if I was forced to go to say Wales or Ireland, I might not want to go there.
Yep.
What if I had my choice? I'd probably go to America, maybe. I go to crikey, Belgium. I might go to Switzerland. I might actually like New Zealand. I've also got a choice of perhaps where I would want to go. So if you kind of turn the arrow back to yourself and ask the question to yourself, all of a sudden you can start to understand perhaps why even I would want to go to a different place.
Absolutely.
But on that point, like you said, in terms of moving to the wider charity sector, and there's obviously been a love, which is a common passion that and point that's kind of reappeared in this podcast, and has allowed you to kind of stay there, from 6 weeks to a much longer, more kind of permanent, almost basis. It'd be interesting now for people who hear the passion, and perhaps it's not necessarily this charity, but there's another charity where it's the Alzheimer's Society, which is also something kind of close to my heart, that is really powerful for them and they want to transition into. What would you say at a high level, if you're thinking about qualifications or maybe skills, what are some of the core things that would really kind of help someone transitioning into the charity space, would you say?
I suppose, in terms of, if we're talking about it in terms of kind of qualifications and various things like that, you can go to university, you can study in various things. So, for example, quite a few of the people who come to our sort of area of the charity sector will be maybe specialists or have degrees in disaster management or international relations, various things like that. But I mean, really, I think it's more than just necessarily having the actual paper qualification. It is about the passion, and like I say, I mean, I've worked in the past with sports sectors, and I think that really for me is one of the biggest reasons as to why I've maybe managed here and find it challenging, yes, but I think I'm able to do it here and able to kind of fit in here is because of maybe the maybe other avenues that I've done in the past and other experiences I've had in the past, particularly, like I say, with things like sports you have to be decisive. I've been a coach for a number of years, so you have to be the one who makes the decision there and then on the ground. And, but in a wider sense too, there's other charities that I've volunteered with or worked with, the Woodland Trust, as I've mentioned before, who just go out, and I say just go out, that's not to do them a disservice, but go and dig drainage trenches at the side of rivers, or build footpaths, it doesn't necessarily take a qualification to do that. What it is a passion to do that, because you might be doing that in November when the weather's horrible in the middle of, Yorkshire,
Yes.
which is exactly when I was doing it. But you can see the trauma and stress there. But it's a real love for that sort of thing. And I think, and again, you can stop me if I'm jumping ahead again, Michael, here, but I think one of the big things is about just actually going out and finding what you're passionate about to do it and try it. That is, as I've already mentioned, the real maybe big drive and big pull maybe to the charity sector is there's lots of organizations, Alzheimer's Society, as you've mentioned there too, who I'm sure would be more than willing to have people volunteer in various ways. Because like you say too, with the Alzheimer's, it's something that's personally quite close to me as well. And, there's like book clubs that people set up in libraries, Alzheimer's book clubs and that, and that needs to be managed or ran by a volunteer, potentially more than that. But it's really good ways to get into these things and really just actually try it out. Because you do in this environment, you just learn as you go. It's always the case of learning as you go. I don't necessarily think there's a tick box of the competencies that you need before coming. It's about what you can bring when you have come.
Yeah, no, it's true. And if I was to kind of reflect on, firstly what you shared, I think there's an overwhelming element of resilience that you've kind of built and developed over time, to kind of move into perhaps more of a crisis management situation. And obviously, roles in the charity sector will be different depending on what you're doing. There's larger organisations, whether it's a Prince's Trust, which is obviously a well-known large organisation, which could be, you might just be in a solely fundraising capacity, or you might be in a more administrative capacity, rather than kind of more frontline and operational. But in terms of this role and what you do in terms of charity sector, there's also and whether it's cliche or not, it's a can-do attitude actually, because it's like, this is a situation I'm presented with. And it is almost sink or swim. You just have to kind of deal with what you're doing. You have to assess very quickly in terms of the information that surrounded you, whether it's one of the kind of distribution places that we are at, and you have to make split-second judgment, just like that. So that will lend itself to perhaps a certain type of individual more than others. But I suppose I share that only because that's just one role in one organisation.
Yep.
Even if we were to take the same organisation with Care4Calais, there'd be more administrative roles or more law roles, perhaps. So there's such a wide breadth of roles in the charity sector. It's no different to any other sector,
Yeah. Absolutely, and I mean, it is very much a thing of you can be on the ground too. I mean, officially, I suppose there's that side of it, which is we would be referred to as humanitarian aid workers. But exactly like you say, there's safeguarding, there's finance, there's and finance and accountancy, there's advocacy, law, and I'm just even trying to think of who we have within ours. There's administrative insofar as, for example, if you wanted to sign up and volunteer with us, there's administrative people who do that process too. Logistics is a particular big aspect for us, whether that's in the literal side of purchasing and organizing transport, or whether that's in the side of managing warehouses and spaces, and supplier chains and donations, obviously, because that's one of the big things that keeps us going. So there are so many. There's such a breadth, as you say, of areas that you can get into within this sector as a whole.
Absolutely, and I think that's where there's always a balance between just follow your passion. And I think I heard someone kind of in a recent podcast I listened to, it was like, that's the worst piece of advice you can ever hear, and I kind of agree to it only to a certain point of view. There's a thing, of course you need to find something that you inherently want to do, because my goodness, when times are hard, you're going to find it, to find that deeper why of why you're doing something. If you actually enjoy it and you have a passion in it, it's going to give you a hell of a lot more chance to continue down that journey. But equally, there's got to be perhaps a skill set or a need from the world as well, alongside that passion, to make it a profession and to allow you to kind of earn a certain amount of money if that is your prerogative. And I think that's the reason, one of the main reasons it's really good to have yourself here, because just so many people disregard the kind of third sector or charity sector, And even if you are kind of financially motivated, which is absolutely nothing wrong with it at all, you look at certain charities and perhaps the bigger ones, whether you agree with them or not, the kind of Prince's Trust or other ones in the world. And, if you are aiming to earn 50, 60, 70,000 pounds, that is incredibly doable at some of
Mhm.
these kind of charity organisations. So, don't, think twice before I only have to do insert banking and finance, whatever sector it is. You can still earn a reasonable living. And, that number I mentioned might be way above what you think. Actually 20, 30,000 pounds would be, that's me, I'm sorted, Michael, I'll be
Mhm.
done. Well, that is inherently a really good aspect to kind of join the charity sector, because you can definitely earn that salary requirements that you want. You'll have a hell of a lot of expertise and skills, because you'll be probably doing a vast amount of jobs, and you'll be doing it in something you actually enjoy and something you're passionate about at the end of the day.
Yep.
And on that kind of point, I suppose, we're kind of starting to delve into the myths and misconceptions, I suppose, about the charity world. And it'd be interesting to know from someone who's been there, done it, kind of got the T-shirt, what do you think are some of those myths, perhaps, that people have about this industry?
I think probably from my kind of experience of it, one of the most damaging things maybe is that it's not for working class people. Like I'm from a working class background, and I think when you see maybe some of those other organizations that you've maybe mentioned, you see it as, oh no, these are actually these are big bucks, these are the top dogs, these are the top echelons of society who are running these organizations. And that might put a lot of people off. It probably makes people think that it's not achievable, that you maybe do have to have lots of qualifications and you have to have a various different kind of not achievable skill sets. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And similarly, I think there's also maybe a bit of a misconception with it, kind of relates to that of, oh, well, if you want to do something like this, you probably have to be willing to either take a big massive pay cut or not be paid at all.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not necessarily sustainable. And I realize that there are aspects of that are true. And that maybe does rule people out, unfortunately. But I think it's a lot more accessible than people realize.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, we mentioned it before that certainly in this sector, there's displaced peoples all over the world. But if you're someone who's listening to this, or if you're from the UK, it's not necessarily the case that you've got to go to Bosnia or Greece or Italy, or further afield. You can get a bus to Calais, and it's not necessarily very expensive, and you can stay here for a day, couple of days, and you can try things out. And I think that side of it is again lost maybe a little bit in the kind of more general news and more general perceptions that people might have. But I think that's probably the most damaging thing, is that it's not for me. I'm not from the right background. I'm not gone to the right university. I've not studied the right thing to do this. And it's I kind of my hope is that myself saying this and talking about this, is proof that this isn't necessarily the case. But also, I mean, you think about it, the other people that we have here, the other team members that I have in Calais, it's not as if they're from the upper echelons, let's say.
Yeah.
It's and I think that's the thing, is you do realize when you're here, actually, hang on a minute, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. It's not that I'm talking to Lord Fonkelquad and or reporting back to such and such. It's actually people who just care.
Yeah.
And I guess it's that old adage of, if there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so true. And I think I would almost go as far as saying, if you're from quote unquote background and you think, oh, I'm not sure what industries I can enter, I would almost go as far as saying the charity sector is probably one of the best ones to enter, because you're going to get people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all shared and united with one kind of vision.
Yeah.
And I mean, I always talk about community and how important community is for me, and I suppose leaving almost like a lasting impact in terms of a legacy for my life. And to join a place where it doesn't matter where you come from, how you speak, what your kind of background is, you're all shared and united against like one kind of common goal, for me is incredibly inspiring. and you kind of see the best of humanity whenever you're in that space. And often I always say, whether it's even at a selfish point of view, every time I personally kind of leave charity areas, whether it's Calais or others outside society, whatever charity space it is, I leave with more energy and more inspired to talk more and do more in my own life than I did before. So I think it's really good to hear that, the reality, and I always talk about the reality. We always hear perceptions of roles, industries, and that's probably the number one thing I'm trying to break in terms of myths and misconceptions, but sharing the reality of these places for people to aspire to. And going on that reality, I suppose, for your particular role in terms of that more crisis management role, and this would probably apply for various other places, whether it's kind of working at different charities in a kind of crisis management aspect. What would you say, and it's always a tricky question, what would you say the average week looks like for you in this role?
Do you know, I thought you were going to ask this, and it's funny, Michael, because I'd already almost prepared a statement answer insofar as I was like, the difficulty here is, and maybe this is just within this particular, it's not, I don't think it is, but just in this particular realm, is we have two different levels of planning here. We have what we hope will happen and what does happen, and I guess that's one of the things as well here is half of what we do is strategic planning and the other half is retrospective action, because you can only plan so much before something else changes that. So for example, if we're talking about longer term planning, right, we might be talking about things like the weather. Okay. So that might impact our operations insofar as in terms of numbers of people we're likely to see on a site.
Yep.
But also in terms of what we're going to give out, because, for example, now here in the north of France, the weather's kind of taken a little bit of a turn recently, and it seems to be getting cooler and wetter. So that means now we're going to stop giving out our T-shirts. We're going to now start thinking about long sleeve tops. We're going to stop giving out summer jackets. We're going to give out waterproofs, and that does play a big part in it as well. Similarly, when things like the weather are worse, then you're less likely to find that people are going to be able to cross to the UK. So that means numbers might actually still stay quite high of people who are here. And therefore, there's obviously there's other difficulties that surround that. So those are things that you can kind of plan in the long term for, and things like what numbers of stock we have when we're expecting to get donations through. The other side of it is the reactionary side of what we do. So just this past week there, we had two evictions of two sites that had roughly about 2,000 people evicted. So we then have to go out and provide aid to people. So that was like, sleeping bags, tents, various things like that, providing that immediate aid. And that's where you can kind of see the two have to go hand in hand. And unfortunately, in this area that I'm in, where sometimes, and this is, I guess, where you get that difficulty in terms of volunteers seeing it, and maybe that's why I always find it interesting, the transition that I've had from being a volunteer to being a staff member in that sense, is I can see why what might seem very frustrating as a volunteer, actually, when you're doing it from the strategic side of it, there's a reason for this. And what I mean by that is people might not understand why we're not giving out sleeping bags, we're giving out tents. But it's because actually, hang on a wee minute here, if we do this, we don't have any sleeping bags for the whole of the winter. And unfortunately, when it gets to November, December time, January, February, where it's wet, cold, miserable, we need those sleeping bags for then, So there is a side of it, I guess, which is kind of public relations, I suppose, you might describe it as. But I mean, my typical week is basically, as I said before, in the mornings, we're in the warehouse. So we do about 3 hours in the warehouse in the morning of preparing stuff. That might be our, as I say, our services items, so the charging and various things like that, hot drinks. Also planning and preparing for our distribution. So that's food packs, that's clothing items, other things like hats, scarves, other non-necessarily like wearable clothes, various things like that. Then every afternoon we will go to different sites. So we go to 4 different sites across Calais and Dunkirk, and we will be on those sites for 3 hours in an afternoon. So from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, providing those services, doing distributions, various things like that, speaking with people, making connections with people. And then obviously, like I say, there's the management side of that. So managing the warehouse in the morning and managing the site in the afternoon. And then when we get back from that, we pack everything down, and then we kind of plan the team that I'm part of, the team of staff here. We plan maybe our next day, or we sit down and have our meeting for what's going to happen for the next week. Various things like that. I would say as well, from the particular avenue that I'm in, we work 3 weeks in a row and then 1 week off. So that's what I was saying before. I'm just on the back of my 1 week off. So this is probably as fresh as I'll look. But you've got me on a good day. But so we work 3 weeks on, 1 week off.
Yeah.
And it can be quite all encompassing, to be honest with you. It is very challenging. There are times, as I say, where you're banging your head against the wall, whether that's to do with things like evictions or what the kind of government's trying to do as deterrent policies, or whether that's more structural things like, how many volunteers that we have. So therefore, if we don't have enough volunteers, we can't manage this, or we can't do this. So we have to try and fit that in instead, So there is a lot of juggling of various different things. And then obviously there's other more, from this side of things, more dark aspects of it, insofar as there's people, unfortunately, who die here trying to make those journeys. And that is very difficult to deal with. But I suppose there's the aspect of it as well, which is from my own personal take of it, and our own kind of take of it as a team, is our response to that is we just do the same thing. We go again and we keep doing this, and we show that whether it's evictions or whatever, that's not going to change, that this is still a situation that needs this response.
Yeah. And you kind of perfectly kind of started to almost allude to kind of, as we kind of pull this to a close, almost my question around what are some of perhaps the biggest challenges with a role and being in let's say, more the crisis management space, and then I suppose vice versa, what are some of the greatest parts of the role?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, actually. I think from the challenging side of it, is the fact of the fact of the matter, which is we are here in a situation that you don't want to be in. And although, as I say, we would probably officially be referred to as humanitarian aid workers, you can never know enough. And I'm like, when I think back, it's like I'm just a 28-year-old bloke who loves hockey and history. What am I doing here? Like deciding what items of clothing or whatever people are going to get, and that does. I think the thing about it is you do sometimes maybe think to yourself, did I make the right call on certain things, or is there something I could have done differently there, or why did that happen? So for example, you might have it where if you're doing a distribution and things aren't going well and you stop that distribution, then you do sometimes think to yourself, maybe when you get home that night, about those people who you didn't give those items to, and maybe it's starting to rain now outside, and that is tough to deal with. But yes. But I think that is kind of countered maybe by the people that you meet here, both in terms of volunteers, but also in particular in terms of the people who are here, the communities that we support, because they're just, some of the people who are here are just fantastic individuals, and you just have the most amazing experiences, the most amazing conversations with people, and that does a lot to give you that other side of it, to give you the real pleasures. I mean, the amount of people that I've met, and like you said it before, Michael, most of the people here in terms of volunteers and all that have a similar viewpoint, which means it's really nice to have chats with people. You find a lot of people who you get on with very well. And then obviously, like I say, in terms of the communities that are here, it's a really nice opportunity to be able to have a chat with people too, and meet people and talk to people about different things, whether it's football or whether it's Sudanese food, But I guess, and I'm aware I don't want to necessarily drag on too much in this, but I guess one of the other particular things that I'm conscious of here as well is that kind of power dynamic that we do sometimes have in this sector. Of, at the end of the day, we as individuals, maybe myself and the team who I'm part of more directly, we can decide if someone gets something or someone doesn't, and whilst it can sometimes be challenging, I think one of the things is the best person that you meet and the worst person that you meet is still entitled to the same protections. There might be someone here, if we're talking about in terms of the communities we support, there might be someone here who is always really smiley, really friendly, always offering to help. And there might be someone who's sat and just glares at you or doesn't want to speak to you.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them deserve the same opportunity. And I think that's it. Is, you know, it's a thing where what we might potentially perceive as, let's say, good manners, that doesn't really mean a lot here. You know, you do really have to put that to the side, and you show the respect that you show to someone, whether they are reciprocal to that. I have absolutely no issues with whether they are or not. You know,
Yeah.
and I think that's a very kind of important thing because it is a particular challenge in this field, and sometimes organisations have, and Care4Calais has in the past. You know, there's been areas where those things haven't necessarily been managed in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's an aspect of that could be taken into wider society, and I think, you know, if you look that respect and that kind of, regardless of the manners or behaviour and whatever it is, treating someone with the same respect and giving them the same opportunities, as you mentioned, you know, you could extrapolate that to wider society, and you look at how politics, media, however you want to kind of frame it, puts us in these little groups. And you know, you can't be nuanced anymore in this world. Unfortunately, you can't be grey. It's either black or white. And at the end of the day, you know, everyone loses. If we're in our
Yeah.
little militant groups and you can't be respectful and you can't listen to someone who has an opposing view to you,
Yeah.
you know, you're mindful or won't be mindful of you actually moving into a little echo chamber and
Yeah.
just listen to views that kind of make you feel good and all the rest of it. And I think that is this discourse that we have on this. You know, obviously it's more usually careers, but in wider sense, the more we can have open conversations, the less ignorance will prevail. And I truly kind of believe that. And that is, I suppose, why I have this podcast and why I asked you on here. So, yeah, I think it's, as more and more, and I'm sure of those who listen to the podcast, there's core aspects that we target around career skills and kind of self-awareness, but this applies to all aspects of your life, you know.
Yep.
And I suppose in terms of that, wider aspects of life and your journey that you've gone through, I suppose yourself, Chris, if you had a younger, fresh-faced person, slight backslap there.
Yeah.
If you had a younger, fresh-faced Chris that you were kind of met, what would be a piece of advice you would give Chris before kind of entering into this world?
Yeah. I think the main thing for me, and from listening to your podcast myself, it's not necessarily, it's a similar thing to most other people would say as well, is you don't necessarily have to kind of hold yourself to what other people expect. I know a lot of the time we talk about it in terms of maybe our peer group of people who are the same age of us, but for me, a lot of it's actually to do with your parents as well. And that's why I deliberately kind of wanted to mention that too, because I think that's a very big challenge for people is, you know, my parents more traditionally kind of, you know, desk jobs, stable jobs. And I keep getting asked that question still now of, but yeah, but when are you going to get a real job? You know, at 28. You know, and I think there is that thing, which is, fortunately now, because both of my parents have been here, they've seen what I do and they've seen why I'm so passionate about it. So that's maybe stopped that little bit. But I think there is, in this sector in particular, there is this kind of area in particular, there's a sometimes people hold themselves to what others expect of them. If we're talking in terms of your peer group, it's where your friends, that friend of mine owns a house, I don't, therefore I'm not doing as well. That friend of mine's married, I'm not, therefore I'm not doing as well. Whatever. There's so many kind of tangible things that people think maybe matter. For some people they do, and I'm not knocking that, but for me they don't. And it did take me a long time to learn that, to be honest with you, Michael, and I'm very glad that I did. And in terms of maybe your listeners, you know, I was only 25 years old when I kind of took a bit of a change. And I do think when I did that, my parents were horrified, to be honest with you. Because they were like, oh, well, you're leaving what we perceive to be a kind of fairly steady life in the job you were doing and the people where you were, and you're moving to the north of France and you're working with refugees. What's happened here? You know, but the problem is, if you listen to that, you'll probably not. You'll think you maybe think, well, what am I doing? Maybe I don't want to take that risk, and that can happen when you're 18, 19 years old or younger, and it can still happen when you're in your 20s or probably older than that. You know, and I think you should be strong in yourself, because in particular, when it comes to your parents, one of the things that I've kind of learned is the conversations that I have with my parents now. For me, that's me, an adult, having a conversation with an adult. We're on level terms. That's not necessarily my parents talking to me as a child. You know, I'm able to make my decisions, as if I stand by them. That is, you know, and I think that's the thing is outside pressures may put you off, particularly something like this sector. May think that tell you that's not a good idea. Stick to the job that you're doing. Stick to the desk or whatever that might be. But actually, if this is something you're really into, give it a try, because it genuinely might change your life. But it'll certainly, if not, it'll give you so many opportunities along the way.
Absolutely. And you know, thank you so much for kind of sharing that, Chris. And I mean, you know, the kind of that comparison and how it kind of like takes away the joy completely from the things you want to do and the things you do, I think is so telling. And what is the worst that can happen? Like, you know, obviously there's calculated risks. If you have mortgage, you have children. I completely understand. I'm not saying this with my head buried in the sand, but there's always something you can do. It might be small, it might be massive. There's always something you can do. And perhaps when you have less financial constraints, you know, that might, you could say that is the best opportunity to kind of take these bold decisions. And the absolute worst, if you were really to look yourself in the eye, what's the worst that can happen? You would probably kind of return back to, you know, parents, or you'll be on the couch with a good friend. You would continue on a different path, and when it's all said and done, you'd have a bloody good story to share.
Yeah.
That's what you would do.
Yep.
And I try my hardest to live my life that when I am on my deathbed, sorry, touch word, I would have lived my life without regrets.
Yep.
And it's none of this kind of live life like it's your last day nonsense. But there's definitely a nuance to actually living my life as my authentic self and doing what I truly want to do.
Yeah.
So as we kind of close, I suppose, this episode, Chris, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you wanted to kind of share?
No, I mean, I just want to emphasize that there's so many there's so many different areas, you know. Medical obviously is a particularly big one, you know, but there's so many avenues to this. You really can find something that suits you. It doesn't just have to be giving out food packs or jumpers in Calais. You know, and it can be nationally. It can be across Britain and the UK, or it can be internationally. And there's if you look, you will find so many areas for doing this. I think there's Indigo is a particular job website that's for volunteering and for like charity jobs as well. So if anyone does ever, just go on and you will see how many different aspects there are.
Yeah, and I know I'm well aware there's a website, I think it's called Charity Jobs as well, which does what it's implementing as well. So we'll be sure to kind of pop a few of the links in the show notes for people who are considering. But if people have heard this conversation and, you know, hopefully it's warmed their heart, and, you know, even if people are, you know, against perhaps the organisation or some of the topics we've mentioned, I think if you can listen to it with a sign of respect, and listen with an open mind and a curious mind, that's all I can kind of ask for people to do. And if they want to perhaps connect with either yourself, Chris, or Care4Calais, or find out more, where would you say is the best place for them to go?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking in terms of Care4Calais directly, you can email our team. I'll be one of the people who picks up that email, and it's just admin@care4calais.org, the number 4. It's really easy to get in touch with that. Or they're on, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the usuals. Or sorry, X as it now is. If it's me directly, like I'm on most social medias as well. And if anybody does have any questions or anything like that, they're more than happy to get in touch with me and ask.
Amazing. And like I said, I'll be sure to kind of share some links in the show notes of perhaps places for people to look at charity jobs, and places to kind of connect with Care4Calais and Chris. And equally, if this conversation has inspired you to kind of transition careers, I will have a link to myself as well to help you on that journey. Because, you know, I'm on a mission to help people be, you know, my journey is to inspire people to do what inspires them at the end of the day. And if that's this sector, you know, absolutely great. So thanks again for your time, Chris.
No worries.
Thanks again to everyone who's listened. If you could leave a 5-star review, that would be amazing. It's really important to kind of share these conversations as wide as possible, and kind of help people kind of make their own transitions in their lives. So thanks again for today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Catapult Your Career.